Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right, so before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to invite you to check out a few great free resources that I created just for runners. To get them, all you have to do is click on the link in the show notes or visit www.stephanienatchek.com. If you visit my website, there's a little pop-up box that comes up and it'll prompt you to enter your email address, and these guides will be sent right to your inbox. The first guide is my fueling guide for runners. So in this resource, you'll find my top fueling tips for runners, as well as some specific meal ideas for both your pre and post-run fuel. If you've been struggling to understand what to eat when to support your running and just figuring out what those meal ideas, what those meals look like, what kind of foods you should be including before versus after you run, what the difference is between pre and post-run fueling, then this guide is exactly what you need to get you started on the right path. The other guide that I created is my strength training guide for runners. So this guide includes both a PDF resource, has some tips, guidelines, and links to my YouTube series where I actually walk you through all of the exercises in the program. This is a great beginner strength training guide for runners who want an effective but efficient full body workout that helps support the key muscles and movements you need to run stronger and injury-free. So once again, both of these guides are available together. I have them put together as a little bundle for you. You can just click on the link in the show notes or go over to www.stephanienatchek.com, enter your email address just the one time, and both of these free guides will get sent to your inbox right away. I hope you enjoy these resources and find them helpful in supporting you and your running. And now let's get into today's episode. So, today we are here to talk about summer training tips and, in particular, of course, training in the heat. So, it is the summer months and it's getting pretty hot out there. It's actually been quite warm out here for a little while already. We've had a very nice hot summer so far. And so, the first question that I wanted to address on this episode today is, why is running in the heat so much harder? What is it about warmer temperatures, that hotter environment, that makes it so much more difficult to tolerate compared to running when it's more moderate outside? And the reality is that the air temperature, the external environmental temperature, and also the humidity in the air has a significant impact on our effort, how hard it is for us to run. And specifically, we can talk about that as our rate of perceived exertion. So RPE is our rate of perceived exertion, and it's essentially a scale of how hard we feel we're working at any given moment. So classically, the original RPE scale that was created was a 6 to 20 RPE scale, but we have a more modified version that most people use these days, especially, in the fitness space here, where it's like a scale of 1 to 10. So if I were to ask you, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard do you feel like you're working right now? 1 being super, super easy, maybe we're just sitting around, not working at all, up to 10, which is the hardest you've ever worked in your entire life, then you would fall somewhere between those on the scale. And so when we're looking at effort and pace and exercise intensity, this RPE scale is a really handy tool for helping us evaluate our effort level and our pacing, especially in changing environments. If you live somewhere with significant temperature changes throughout the year, then it's that much more important to be really tuned in to how different paces and how running feels in your body, because the air temperature and the environment outside is going to dramatically change how hard you feel you're working on any given day. And so why exactly is this? Well, the answer is because when we do any physical activity, but when we run, we generate heat in our muscles. So our working muscles are generating heat as part of their metabolic processes. This heat needs to be dissipated, right? This heat needs to go somewhere. Our body has to do something with this heat that we're generating. This is why we sweat when we exercise, because we are creating heat as part of our muscle metabolism processes. And so then we have to sweat in order to remove the heat from our bodies and keep our bodies cool. Sweating, you can kind of think of sweating like our body's air conditioning system. And our body's air conditioning system, our ability to sweat, is really important to maintain a normal body temperature, a normal range of body temperature. If our body temperature rises beyond our ideal range, this is where we get heat illness or like heat stroke and that sort of thing happening, which, if left untreated, heat and the risks around heat illness and heat injury really seriously as runners, especially if we're doing prolonged exercise in really hot, humid conditions, having ways and strategies of keeping ourselves cool and hydrated is absolutely critical for our success and, of course, our health. So when we sweat, there's this increase in blood flow out to the skin, where the sweat is then excreted. I have realized that I do not like the word excreted, but I couldn't think of anything else to say there. The sweat is then lost. It goes through our pores out onto the surface of our skin. And it's the actual evaporation of sweat off of our skin that cools us down. So it's that process of the sweat leaving through our skin cells, through the pores, and then being evaporated into the air. That's what actually helps to keep our body temperature cooler. That's how sweating works to cool us off. And that loss of fluid through our sweat is going to take away some of our blood volume. And this is why we see dehydration occurring faster in hotter temperatures, because the more heat we're producing, the more sweat that we're losing, the faster we're going to be losing that blood volume. Now, what's also happening is that when we are needing more blood flow to be redirected out to the skin to help keep us cool, that means that there's less blood flow available for our muscles. So our working muscles are not getting the same blood flow that they would when it's cooler outside and we're sweating less. The other thing that makes a huge, huge difference is, of course, the humidity in the air. So the temperature plays a role because we have the heat that we're producing in our bodies that we have to do something with, we have to get rid of. But then also the external heat that's being put on our bodies from the air temperature, we also have to deal with, right? We also have to do something about that. And this is why in really hot weather, you can sweat when you're not even exercising, right? You're just sitting around and you're sweating. But the humidity in the air also makes a significant difference, because humidity is essentially how much moisture there already is in the outside air. And so if you imagine if there's already lots and lots of moisture in the air, it's harder for the sweat off of our skin to evaporate into that air because it's already more saturated with fluid, with water. Now, as opposed to running outside in a very dry heat where there's very little moisture in the air, that sweat off of our skin evaporates much more readily. So we really get a more effective cooling effect in drier heat versus in more humidity. And so this is why, if you are running somewhere where the temperatures are very dry, you may get back from a run on a hot day and you're not dripping sweat. Like, you're not noticing that you have sweat a lot because, your skin might be quite dry when you get back from that run. But don't take that to mean that you didn't sweat as much or that you don't still need to hydrate well. It just means that sweat is actually evaporating faster, as opposed to running in a really high humidity environment where you're probably going to have more sweat dripping off of you and maybe just sitting on the skin, not really going anywhere. And of course, this for a lot of people means that running in drier environments is more comfortable. We find that it's easier to tolerate, even if the temperature is higher. I personally find, even if the temperature is a lot higher, I am much more comfortable running in very dry heat versus a really humid but maybe cooler day, just simply because of that impact of how much sweat evaporation you're actually getting in your body's ability to really deal with that heat accumulation. So, as I mentioned, regardless of the humidity and how sweaty you are when you get back from a run, like regardless of how much you feel like you're losing in terms of fluid, just because you're not dripping with sweat after a run, like just because you don't have like noticeable sweat on your body, doesn't mean that you didn't sweat. It doesn't mean that you don't need to have more fluids in those hotter temperatures than you do in the cold weather. It just is really just a factor of the environment. And this is a question that a lot of people ask about. Like, you see people all the time saying, well, I'm a really heavy sweater. I do or I don't sweat a lot. Or, people often have kind of comments and questions or even concerns about how much they're sweating. And really, the outside environmental air temperature has a lot more to do with how much you sweat on any given day compared to like you as a person. But what's interesting, and we're going to talk about this in the next part of this episode, what's interesting is that when you are more acclimated to the heat, when your body is undergoing those physiological changes that help you deal with heat more effectively, you actually sweat more. You lose more fluid. So sweating less doesn't mean that you are more fit necessarily. A lot of it has to do with the outside air temperature, or it could be a factor of how much heat acclimation you've gone through. So when we're running in hot weather, one of the big important takeaways to remember is that you are going to get dehydrated faster because of this extra fluid loss. So I'm always a big fan and always a big proponent of running with fluids. Like if you're going to be running for anything over 30 minutes, I really think that you should run with some hydration. I know that there's a lot of people who will do pretty significant long runs without bringing along any sort of fluid replacement. I don't think that that's a great idea, even though you can get through the run. I think that fluid replacement during a run is really important, especially when we're talking about hotter weather. What I also would want runners to do, what I also want you to do, is just overall in your life, day to day, increase your fluid intake all throughout the day. Because just because we're just drinking a little bit more, or maybe starting to take some fluids along with us on that run when it's warm outside, we need more fluid overall. We want to go into that run as hydrated as possible. So in hot weather, it is that much more important just to maintain optimal hydration kind of all the time, because chances are when the temperature is really warm outside, you are going to be sweating. You're going to be losing sweat. You're going to be losing fluid faster than you can replace it. We have a limited ability to drink and absorb fluid during a run. Like when we're exercising, we can only drink so much. Like if you've ever tried this before, there's only so much fluid that you can put in your stomach when you're running. There's only so much fluid that you can carry with you when you're running. We've got great technology with like hydration packs and bladders that hold like several liters and all kinds of things like that. But there's still, especially on these very long runs, there is a limit to how much fluid you're going to have available. And so if you're already starting that run at a disadvantage because you're dehydrated starting the run, then not only are you having to replace or trying to replace what you're losing, but you're also having to play a little bit of catch up with the fact that you're starting at that disadvantage. So really, we want to be drinking more fluid overall, but of course also including lots of high water foods as part of our diet. And that's going to be things like fruits and vegetables and yogurts and soups and other beverages. Doesn't always just have to be water. You can drink lots of different things that still count towards your total fluid consumption for the day, but really just focusing on hydration as a whole. So then what happens when we get acclimated to the heat? Like what is heat acclimation all about? And there are some people who find that they don't, the heat doesn't really bother them that much. Like they tolerate the heat pretty well. They enjoy running outside in hot weather. Other people, they really struggle through running in the heat. And part of the reason can be heat acclimation. And, of course, we're all different. And some people just don't like hot weather as a whole. They just find that it's uncomfortable for them. Other people have a really hard time tolerating the cold. I mean, we're all different and there's definitely no right or wrong answer here. But if you know that you're going to be racing or doing a lot of training, in hotter environments, especially for anybody who travels to a race that's going to be in a hotter climate than you're used to. There are some really cool benefits to spending some time training in hotter temperatures to allow your body to adapt so that you can deal with the heat more effectively. Now, it's important to note that this does take several weeks of consistent training in hot weather. So it's not something that you can, if you're traveling for a race, you can't just sort of show up the day before, do a run outside in the humidity, and then you'll be good to go for your race the next day. It takes several weeks. There are some different ways that you can mimic that environment to try and improve your heat acclimation if it is something that you need to really take into consideration. But hopefully you'll be able to do enough training at home, kind of near where you live, so that when you do travel, you are acclimated to the heat if you need to be. You might find that mentally you see some benefits of feeling more comfortable running in the heat, but physiologically, your body is also adapting to this change. Like your body is also doing a better job of tolerating that heat and getting better at dealing with and dissipating heat from your body. So the first physiological change that takes place here is that there's a change in our sweat composition. So sweat, of course, is mostly water. Like all things in our bodies, it's fluid. And so it's mostly water that's making up sweat. But the composition of that sweat, how much electrolyte we're losing in that sweat, changes when we are more acclimated to the heat. And so specifically what happens is we do a better job of conserving sodium. So if we are not acclimated to the heat, then when we sweat, we're going to be sweating a lot and we're going to be losing potentially a lot of sodium in that sweat. But as we get more acclimated to the heat, our body actually does a better job of hanging on to more of that sodium and conserving it, which is important because, of course, electrolytes are required for proper muscle contractions and neurological function. So we need those electrolytes. They're very important. We don't want to lose too many of them in our sweat. But we actually sweat more. And this is really fascinating because I think a lot of runners feel as though when they're more heat acclimated or when they're more fit, they're more trained, that kind of thing, they would be able to get away with drinking less and they wouldn't need as much fluid when they're running. But the opposite can actually be true, where if you are doing a lot of training in the heat, you're going to actually lose more sweat as a whole, more fluid, and you're going to start sweating sooner to help prevent that rise in body temperature that is going to occur with the heat generation from our muscles and the heat from the external environment. So it's not that you are going to be able to get away with drinking less. You actually may need to drink more, which is part of the reason why I really strongly encourage runners to just increase their overall fluid intake throughout the day to help maybe account for some of that excess fluid loss or additional fluid loss that you're going to see. Because what you don't want to do is think that, oh yeah, because I've been doing all this summer training, I've been doing all this running in the heat, I, can just like bring my little 250 or 300 ml bottle with me and sip on that for a long run and I should be fine. Absolutely not. You're going to be sweating sooner. You're going to be sweating more, losing more fluid. And so we actually have to replace that to a higher degree. But I do recommend really understanding and knowing your personal fluid needs, because the amount, like your hourly sweat loss rate, and of course the composition of your sweat, how much salt is in there, how much, other electrolytes and things are in your sweat, does vary a lot from person to person, and also, of course, can vary throughout the year depending on the environment that we're running in. And so one way to do this is to check your weight before and after a run to see how much fluid you've lost during the course of that run. Now, this is not a perfect measurement, of course. It's not a perfect science. Like few things are a perfect science, but it is a really good way, a tool that I've certainly used with clients to really highlight how much you can lose. Like it can be amazing sometimes how many liters of fluid, which 1 liter of fluid is 1 kilogram of weight, which is 2.2 pounds. To have someone see, wow, like, the little 500 ml bottle that I was sipping on for a 2-hour run is nowhere near meeting my needs. So checking your weight before and after, and then anything you drank during the run, you would add that to the amount of weight you lost. And then that's going to be your losses for that run. You can divide that per hour to get like an hourly sweat loss rate, or you could just, keep track of how much you lose on any given run, but it gives you a good understanding and a good starting point. The other thing that we can use nowadays, we've got some really cool new technology in the realm of personalized hydration, because up until this point, things like weights and having to maybe go to a lab or do some other like sodium sweat loss type of testing, it wasn't super accessible to people, and I didn't find it to be accessible to sort of the everyday runner out there. But now we have things like the Nix biosensor. It's a wearable patch that actually analyzes your sweat, the amount of sweat you're losing, and the composition of that sweat during your runs. So this is a really great new piece of technology that's less than a year old, that is able to give you more feedback and more information about what your needs are, so that you can more adequately match your ability to maintain hydration and, of course, get the right amount of electrolytes for you during your training sessions. So understanding your personalized hydration and electrolyte requirements, I think, is really key for success if you're going to be racing in hot environments where dehydration is just such a huge risk. The other thing that we want to do when we're training in the heat is we want to make sure that we are wearing light colored clothing and really light fabrics that are meant for training, like for wicking sweat. I learned this lesson the hard way. I mean, of course, if you're like me as a runner, you live in your training gear, right? Like if I don't have to be somewhere fancy, then I'm wearing, all of my running gear kind of all the time. And the other weekend, I went out for a bike ride. We were going to visit some friends, and I had just thrown on this like thick cotton heavy t-shirt just over top of my swimsuit to go ride our bike down to meet up with some friends. And I felt like I just couldn't cool down for the rest of the day. I was just so hot in this big, bulky, thick cotton t-shirt that I was actually just, dying. And it wasn't even that long of a bike ride, but it was a very hot day. Whereas I think if I had been wearing, like one of my running tops or something like that instead, it probably would have made a huge difference. So wearing the right gear and the right clothing for training in the heat makes a big, big difference. And of course, wearing a hat and sunglasses and all of that stuff too is a great idea. You can also do a lot to cool yourself down before your runs and during your runs. This could be taking like a cool shower, like actually like submersing your body in cool water before you run. And of course, sipping on cold fluids while you're out on your run. So, putting ice in your bottles if you can, having replacement bottles, like running in a shorter loop that's kind of close to home where you can like put some ice in a bottle and maybe leave it in a cooler or something for yourself. But just trying to make sure that you're sipping on and using cool fluids to cool yourself down before and during. You do want to be careful with ice, though, putting ice directly on your body. And this is because when we have that very strong like shock of cold, like when you put ice directly on your skin, what actually happens is it causes your blood vessels to constrict and move away from the skin. And that can actually inhibit some of the benefits that we're looking for here. And of course, we can also get things like burns on our skin from putting ice directly on the skin. So I would be really careful around using ice, ice packs that you wrap in a towel or something. Like just be careful and avoid putting ice directly in contact with your skin. Also, another, thing that a lot of people are talking about these days, a really kind of popular recovery strategy that a lot of runners use is like ice baths, like the fully, submersing themselves completely in like ice water. And this is also something that we don't see great data on in terms of exercise recovery. Now, if it just makes you feel good and you just enjoy it, then be my guest. But if you're looking at it from a recovery perspective, because of that reduction in blood flow, because of that vasoconstriction that happens with, that very, very cold exposure, we actually don't see a benefit in terms of recovery, and it may impair muscle recovery. So that's what the science there is showing us. So cool is fine, like a cool shower or like cool water, can definitely be a good thing and can really help with this heat acclimation process, but just be careful of how cold and like ice. Now, of course, if you're able to, we also want to sleep in cooler temperatures if possible. So you may wonder, like, well, if I want to get heat acclimated, is there a benefit to turning off my air conditioning and like spending as much time as possible in the heat to maybe get the benefit from like a shorter time frame? And that's not the case. So what we want to do is we want to do the training in warm temperatures, like we want to have the exposure to the heat so that we can get the adaptations. But then we want to, overnight when we're sleeping, for better sleep quality and better rest and recovery, actually sleep in cooler temperatures if at all possible. Now, I know if you don't have access to air conditioning or something like that, then, obviously it's going to be challenging in really warm environments, but do what you can to cool yourself down. And that may be even something like a cool shower before going to sleep. Now, this is the most important thing though. When we are training in the heat, what is so critical is slowing down. This does not mean that you have lost fitness in the summer. I don't care what your Garmin says. I don't care how much your Garmin says your VO2 max is now in the tank. Now it sucks compared to what it was 6 months ago. All of those numbers and that data and pacing information and all of those metrics don't mean anything in these really like big fluctuations in environment and in temperature. And this is why, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, rate of perceived exertion is so key. Understanding how effort feels and how intensity feels in your body is the most important metric to go on here. Our easy pace, when it's very mild outside, and I'm in Canada, so I'll say when it's say 15 degrees outside, I have no idea what that is in Fahrenheit. I don't know, maybe 50 Fahrenheit? I'm not sure. Anyway, when it's cooler and mild and very comfortable outside, that easy pace is going to be faster than when we are running when it is 35 degrees with the humidex like we get so often here in Manitoba. I think that's probably like maybe 90 degrees or something Fahrenheit. Again, I have no idea. But that's where we see such a difference. So what is so key is slowing down, listening to your body, staying in your effort zones versus trying to really kind of push through and maintain a specific pace in fluctuating temperatures. Because once you're no longer in the correct training zone, now you're working maybe too hard, you're pushing yourself. And this is where we see an increased risk for things like injuries, overtraining, of course, more dehydration, and you're just not going to get the same benefits out of really staying in that easy aerobic zone for most of your miles. The great news here, though, is that when you're still staying in your correct training zones and you're still kind of following that structure, even if your paces aren't the exact same as what they were before, this can really pay off significantly when it comes time for fall races that you might be doing in slightly cooler temperatures. Because now that you've had this summer of training in warmer weather, when the temperature drops, you get this added benefit of it then feeling much cooler, and you're not going to struggle nearly as much in cooler temperatures. So putting in the time now, slowing down, staying hydrated, taking care of yourself, staying safe in the heat really does pay off when those fall races roll around. And so that brings up another question that someone asked recently on my Instagram. And if you don't already follow me on Instagram, then you can find me at Steph the Runner's Dietitian. And someone asked on one of my posts about training in the heat. They said, well, can I just run on the treadmill? Like, do I have to do this? Do I have to run outside in the heat? Or can I just stay inside in the summertime? And this really depends on if you race, because of course, in order to be a real runner, you do not need to sign up for races. We talk about racing a lot as runners, and I know there's a huge race focus here, but you do not have to race in order to be a runner or in order to enjoy this podcast. So if you are racing, then it is important to be training in a similar environment to where you will be racing if you don't want to have a potentially disastrous race day. Of course, there's always going to be a point where it may not be safe or necessary to run outdoors, especially if you aren't used to it or if you don't have to run in those temperatures. But if you're going to be even racing in, say, some pretty extreme environments, like if you're going to be doing maybe like an ultra run in the desert, or if you're going to be doing, you know, some kind of outdoor run and it's going to be in a place where it is really hot and really humid. I know there are not a ton of races that take place. Like they're, you know, pretty niche, some of those races. But you also can get a random day where it's not generally that hot outside, and then it is. You know, our Manitoba Marathon here in 2022, we had not been having a warm spring. It had actually been cold and snowy way into the month of May, which was just horrendous for us trying to train for the marathon. And then all of a sudden, we just had this like freak, super hot, super humid day the day of the race. And, you know, the challenge for everybody that day was that no one had any heat training. Like nobody was acclimated to the heat because it was just this like weird one-off of this crazy warm weather. And so even if it's not supposed to be hot, even if it's not necessarily going to be hot where you're training, you may get some kind of crazy weather that you're not expecting. So if you're potentially going to be racing in an environment where there is even a chance that it could be very hot, very humid, something like that, then yes, absolutely, I would encourage you to do at least some amount of running outside to understand your fueling strategy, your hydration plan, your electrolyte plan. Make sure that you can carry what you need, how much you need, or of course, you've got aid stations and things like that, like just so that you know what's going to happen on the day and you can be really confident in your plan for the day. But of course, that doesn't mean that every single run has to be outdoors or that, you know, you need to run outdoors when it is like, you know, when there's like an extreme heat warning and it is very, you know, potentially unsafe to be doing that. We've also, I know there's been some concerns about air quality in a lot of places. There's been a lot of smokiness in the air this summer in a lot of areas. And so again, if there are weather warnings telling you that you should not be exercising outdoors, it is not safe, you know, the air quality is not good enough to be running outdoors, then please listen to those warnings. They're there for a reason. They're not there, you know, just to try and keep people inside. They are definitely, you know, really important, especially if you have maybe asthma or any other lung or breathing conditions that can be really impacted a lot by air quality. Then that is when it makes sense to definitely do training indoors. You want to reflect though. Keep an eye on how much of your training you're doing. Like, are you being consistent with your running? Because if you look back over, you know, the weeks or the month of your training, and it's always a good idea to reflect. I always recommend reflecting on these things. But if you look back and you see that, you know what, I actually missed 20% of my runs this month because it was so hot outside, then this is where we maybe need to be looking at what time of day are you running? You know, it's better to be running early morning or later in the evenings versus the heat of the day, if at all possible. Or it may be a time for you to invest in something like a gym membership, or, you know, buying a treadmill if you want to. But a gym membership is you know, definitely going to be a lower expense in the short term anyway, to be able to at least be consistent with your training. And this is important because, you know, being able to keep up our consistency with our training is still going to be the number one thing that leads us to have a more successful race experience. Acclimating to the heat, training in the environment you're going to be racing in, staying hydrated, having an electrolyte plan, wearing the right gear, you know, all of this stuff is of course key. But even if we do all that stuff right, but still we just didn't get the miles in, we didn't get the consistency in with our workouts, we can ultimately wind up disappointed just because of that. So no, you don't have to run outside all summer long, especially if you live in a place where the heat is like really, really extreme. But you do also want to make sure that you can be as consistent as possible with your training and you're not missing, you know, several workouts a week just because of the temperatures outside. So that is it for today's episode, where we talked about summer training tips, what is happening in the heat, why the heat is so hard to train in, and some ways that you can help your body get more acclimated to the summer heat so that you can have a really successful summer of running and of course, a successful fall race if you are in fact signed up for one. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Of course, if you have questions, comments, anything like that, the best place for us to connect is over on my Instagram. And once again, you can find me there at Steph the Runner's Dietitian. Thanks so much for tuning in. I really, really appreciate you joining me for today's episode, and we will catch you next week. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.